COVID-19. We thought within a year it would be gone, but then it's still here. We are stuck with it, and we've gotten used to this. Wearing a face mask wherever we go. And on that note, here comes one of the most first world problems in our generation. How am I going to use Face ID if I'm wearing a mask all the time? Don't at me. It's a legitimate concern. Face ID was first introduced in 2017 on the iPhone X, and since then it's been working really well for me, and I believe for everyone else as well. It's fast and it's secure. What more can you ask for? I personally like Face ID way more than Touch ID, because any sort of moisture on my hand, like after I wash my hand or when I'm sweating, it will just render Touch ID useless. For Face ID, it's way easier. Sometimes I don't even explicitly remember I need to unlock my phone, because my face is the password. I just pick up my phone, glance, and go. That's the beauty of it, until it stops working. With this pandemic, we have to wear masks everywhere we go. But every time I'm wearing a face mask, Face ID would just simply not work. So a lot of the times I need to revert back to using my passcode, and that is just such a chore when you've gotten used to using biometric authentication. And with COVID having no sign of going away, there are rumours that Touch ID will be coming back to the iPhone 13, or whatever they call the next iPhone, because 13 is unlucky. And that is supposedly a very simple solution to the problem. Face ID doesn't work, bring in Touch ID. But there are quite a few reasons why I don't think Apple is going to take the plunge back into Touch ID. And I'm going to talk about these reasons one by one. The first reason why I don't think Apple is going to opt for Touch ID in the next iPhone is that moving from Face ID to Touch ID can be seen as a move backwards. A lot of people would like to make the comparison between the iPad and the iPhone, especially with the latest iPad Air released in 2020 with a Touch ID sensor. A lot of people are saying, hey, the newest iPad Air has a Touch ID sensor, why won't the next iPhone have one? That's when we need to think about how these products are developed quite differently. The iPad Air has always had a Touch ID sensor. All these years, the Touch ID was built in to the home button, and in the midst of the 2020 redesign for the iPad Air, Apple moved the Touch ID sensor to the lock button. So very simply put, never ever in Apple's history did an iPad Air have Face ID built in. For the iPhone, that's totally different. Ever since the release of the iPhone XR and XS in 2018, every single new iPhone except the iPhone SE has the True Depth camera system and Face ID built in. And if all of a sudden Apple is bringing Touch ID back to the iPhone, it would seem like Apple is going backwards. Now here's the tricky thing. I'm not saying personally that going from Face ID to Touch ID is a step backwards. I'm just saying it can be seen as a step backwards in the eyes of the average customers. And the reason behind that is, of course, Face ID was released way later than Touch ID. And if Apple is going from Face ID to Touch ID on an iPhone, perceptually that seems like going back in time. And if Apple realizes going from Face ID to Touch ID is a step backwards in the minds of the average customer, I don't think they would do it. I really doubt they will want to seem like they're going back in time. Now, the second thing is the dilemma between two methods of implementing Touch ID on the iPhone. There are rumors saying that for the next iPhone, Touch ID might be implemented in the lock button, but there are also rumors saying that it might be implemented in the display. Which method is easier? Definitely Touch ID on the lock button. Touch ID on the button has been done for ages, since iPhone 5S. And in earlier Sony Android phones, they have implemented a fingerprint sensor in the lock button as well. So that is absolutely not a very new concept. And of course, Apple has implemented Touch ID on the lock button of the 2020 iPad Air. So that is definitely doable on the next iPhone. But the weird thing is that there are quite a few other smartphone manufacturers who have implemented fingerprint sensors right in the display, or what they call an in-display fingerprint sensor. And these manufacturers include with some big players in the smartphone market, including Samsung and OnePlus and Huawei. And the general impression is that building the fingerprint sensor right in the display is a very elegant solution. Because the same instant you tap the display, it can check your fingerprint and it can unlock the phone for you in one easy step. And now, if Apple is opting for Touch ID on the lock button instead of on the display, that would seem like Apple is behind the competition in terms of building the fingerprint sensor into the display. At the same time though, Apple building Touch ID right in the display might not be an ideal situation either. With the iPhone SE having Touch ID on the home button, the 2020 iPad having Touch ID on the lock button, MacBook Pros and MacBook Airs having Touch ID on the power button, if we're introducing an iPhone with Touch ID on the display, that means there will be 4 ways of using Touch ID on a certain Apple device. That is going to be quite confusing for the average customer. If you're telling an average customer, unlock your phone with Touch ID, where do they put the finger? Is there a home button? Do I put my finger on the lock button? Or do I put it right on a display? With so many factors that Apple need to consider, that is not going to be an easy decision for the Apple design team. Now the third problem with Touch ID making a comeback to the iPhone is this. What will happen to Face ID? Now, first and foremost, my prime argument. Even if Apple is bringing Touch ID back to the iPhone, I don't think Apple will remove Face ID from the iPhone. As I said, Face ID has been available on new releases of iPhones since 2018, except the iPhone SE. And of course, Face ID is enabled by the True Depth camera system. And the True Depth camera system is very important to one thing, AR. This is the one thing Apple has been pushing every year. Every year in the WWDC, they have been releasing new features for augmented reality, whether it's about playing games with other people or just having a silly filter in Snapchat. The True Depth camera system is very important to Apple's dream of an AR ecosystem. And for Apple to remove Face ID completely in the next generation of iPhone would just be impossible. But that actually leaves more question for the Apple design team to figure out. What is the user experience going to be like if an iPhone has both Face ID and Touch ID available? Are they going to work together? Are they going to work separately? When a user is trying to unlock their phone, how would 2 biometric authentication systems work together? Is it going to be a priority thing where the iPhone would use Face ID to find a face first, and then if they can't detect a face, they would try to use Touch ID to detect a fingerprint? Or is it going to be like both Touch ID and Face ID will be fired at the same time, and whichever one unlocks the phone first will just unlock the phone? Or maybe a more intriguing move, is there like a maximum security setting that requires both your face and your fingerprint to unlock your phone? And of course the million-dollar question is, which of these mechanisms will be easiest for the user? I am a daily user of the iPhone, and even I wouldn't know which one I prefer. I think this will be a very interesting thing to look for when the time comes. Now moving on to my fourth and last point, is there actually a better way than using Touch ID to solve the face mask problem? And you know what? We actually might have an answer to this question. Just at the beginning of this week, iOS 14.5 Beta 1 was released to Apple developers, and there was one key feature that everyone was talking about, and that is the ability to use Face ID even if you have a mask on. Apple is apparently testing a mechanism where an Apple Watch can be used to unlock an iPhone if a face mask happens to fail the Face ID authentication. And the mechanism is like this. If you're wearing a face mask and you can't unlock your iPhone with Face ID, your iPhone can still unlock itself if your Apple Watch happens to be password protected but unlocked with your passcode worn on your wrist, and of course you are nearby. This feature has to be enabled by the user manually, but I have to say that is not a bad idea at all. With initial testing, people are already reporting really satisfactory unlocking performance. Of course, I do realize that this does not resolve everything. Not every iPhone user happens to own an Apple Watch as well. If Apple is only offering this solution for the face mask problem, that means there would still be a huge chunk of iPhone users who wouldn't be able to use Face ID when they're wearing a face mask. But nonetheless, Apple is trying. Apple is trying to implement new software features to resolve a physical face mask problem, and that I would always consider as a step in the right direction. At the end of the day, this debate on whether to add Touch ID or not to the next generation of iPhones is just because of a temporary event, the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I say temporary, it's been more than a year now, but we're still looking forward to the day when the virus would subside and we can resume our normal lives. And of course, Touch ID seems like a great solution to the face mask problem, but even adding or subtracting one single feature can have consequences beyond the current product. It changes how future generations of the same product are developed. And if Apple really wants to bring Touch ID back into the iPhone because of the face mask and because of the pandemic, does it mean all future generations of the iPhone will have both Touch ID and Face ID? Or will Apple remove Touch ID when we're done with COVID-19? These are things that we simply don't know right now. Well, at the meantime, if you're fed up with not being able to unlock your phone with Face ID when you're wearing a mask, then I guess the only solution is to buy an Apple Watch. With COVID-19 still around, I hope everyone is staying healthy and staying well. Do you think that Touch ID will return to the next generation of iPhone? I personally don't think so. But do drop a comment down below and tell me what you think. For now, remember to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. And I can't wait to see you in the next one.